With so much inaccurate information about diet and health out there, the last thing you would believe is misleading, and the one we have trust in most are research studies. People rely on unbiased research to find out important statistics about all facets of nutrition, from sugar intake and food supplements, to genetically modified food and cereals. However, recent research suggests there is bias in industry-funded research studies, the full extent of which is still unknown. We're starting a whole program of work in this area. The first thing we did was a review of all the studies that have looked at the association of industry sponsorship with the outcomes of nutrition studies, said Lisa Burrow, Professor, Chair of Medicine's Use and Health Outcomes and Head of the Bias Node at the Charles Perkins Center at the University of Sydney. Burrow and her team reviewed 775 reports in the medical literature, narrowing down to 12 relevant reports, to determine whether nutrition studies funded by the food industry were associated with outcomes favorable to the sponsor. It was a little surprising because most of the studies only looked at the conclusion of the research. By that I mean their author's interpretation. So, if it were industry-sponsored, they were more likely to have a conclusion that favored the industry sponsor, Burrow said. What we found is that only 3 of the studies looked at the actual results or data. That's something we're really interested in doing in the future. Burrow's investigation has confirmed that researchers know little about the influence of corporate sponsors on nutrition studies. However, the research community has been at odds over the amount of damage funding bias is bringing to people's understanding of food and health, and what should be done to stop it. On one end, experts have been highly critical of industry-funded studies and say that type of research should almost always be avoided. On the other end, researchers who accept corporate funds say funding is a very small part of a larger issue, if even an issue at all. Dr. Marion Nestle, Nutrition and Food Studies professor at New York University, falls in the first group. I worry a lot about the effects of industry sponsorship on public belief in the credibility of nutrition science, says Nestle, the author of Soda Politics, Taking on Big Soda and Winning. Just because a claim is supposedly backed by clinical studies doesn't mean it can be trusted. Even if the research is scientifically sound, Nestle said. Ultimately, the basis for many corporate-sponsored research is marketing, not just public health. And if there is no scientific basis for the research, companies can make one up. Dr. David Katz, nutritionist and the founding director of Yale University's Prevention Research Center, says there is a difference between conflict of interest and confluence of interest, when funders' vested interests are in line with the public's interest. According to him, it's a mistake for people to just assume that corporate bias always falls under the former, instead of the rush to judgment. Nutritionists should focus on raising industry standards and improving elusive nutrition research. I think that's what we should be working on, Katz said. Where do we draw the line? What are the things that are required to avoid conflict of interest, to allow for confluence of interest? An all-out ban on corporations in research would leave people in need, says Katz, who uses the impact of corporate-led research on the pharmaceutical industry as an example. Without corporations, many common medicines and pharmaceutical products people use, such as antibiotics and cancer-treating drugs, wouldn't exist. If food companies want to use research to make a better product and improve consumers' health at the same time, we should let them. Advocates of industry funding, like Dr. Andrew Brown, a scientist and researcher at the Nutrition and Obesity Research Center and Office of Energetics at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, argue that corporate funding is not really the issue on which to focus. We like to say that with science, there's only 3 things that matter: the data, the way the data were collected, and the logic connecting the data to the conclusions, Brown said. Brown echoes Katz in saying there are bigger fish to fry in nutrition research. Instead of immediately labeling corporate-sponsored studies as problematic, Brown argues critics should tackle the larger issue of conflict of interest in nutrition research, finding far-reaching ways to hold researchers accountable for their scientific methods, not who